Good morning and welcome to my study. Thanks for clicking on the link and checking out this video. My name is Chris and I am a pastor here at Langley Emmanuel Christian Reformed Church, and in these series of videos we take some time to think theologically and liturgically about what it means to be Christian in the 21st century. Now this morning I want to spend some time thinking intentionally around a topic that is very prescient right now in society, that is in front of all of us, and it's around vaccines and vaccine usage as Christians. Now, before I begin too far, let me just say I am not an epidemiologist or a virologist. I am not a biologist or a chemist. My training in those things does not go beyond high school. I have done my best to read reputable and peer-reviewed sources and to listen to voices that I know and trust and experts in their field. But this is more of a pastor theologian's engagement with this process and conversation and reality than it is a medical one. And so know that. Also know that as we talk about vaccines together in a 10-minute or so video, we're trying to summarize what has been generations of thought, and books have been written on this by good Christian ethicists for quite some time. And so we are really just starting a conversation here, maybe giving a little bit of groundwork and framework for that. But I do think it is important for us to think theologically about these things as they come up and as our culture is talking about them and living in the midst of all of this as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So by way of introducing this topic, I want to be clear that our tradition, the Reformed tradition more generally, because of our understanding of God's work in the world and the scope of his kingdom, because of ideas like sphere sovereignty and the regular pursuit of knowledge with a high standard of excellence that is in our tradition and is in our history, generally, we are not opposed to scientific endeavors and advancements, and we rather work in those fields and towards them and encouragement. More generally still, the Christian tradition, sort of Catholically, for the vast majority of our history together and for the vast majority of Christians, we have not believed in what's called medical non-interventionism. That is to say, we believe that it is good and right to use the good gifts of medicine and technology and the advancement. And we ground that, in a sense, all the way back in the creation story, right? In Genesis 1, God speaks to Adam and Eve, our first parents, and he tells them to fill the earth and subdue it. Right? This is the creation mandate and the cultural mandate that God gives us as his image bearers in the world, to be co-creators with him. And what we know in that story, and from that story, right, in Genesis 3, you get the rebellion of our first parents against God's created order, and we have the fall into sin. And as Paul says in Romans, that as a result of that rebellion, all creation is groaning under the weight of sin. But that creation mandate and cultural mandate still exists for us as humans, as those created in the image of God. So we are still called to fill the earth and to subdue it. The old language there is to have dominion over it. And part of subduing a world, part of exercising our vice-regent authority as God's image bearers in the world, is to push back against the effects of sin in the world. As the creation groans, we seek to limit its cause for groaning. And so part of subduing the created order is pushing back against the effects of illness or disease, against the effects of death and suffering in the world. And one good tool in doing that is medical sciences. One good tool in advancing that call to subdue the earth is medical technology. Another theological grounding for us in this kind of conversation is what sometimes is called the common good argument. But the reality there is to take what Jesus says is the second greatest commandment, right? That is to love your neighbor as you love yourself, and to apply that to our living and working in the world. And so how do we as Christians love our neighbors well? Part of that might mean for us thinking about accepting and utilizing the good gifts that these vaccines provide. Now, we should and must think deeply and intentionally about these sorts of things. And right now in Canada, there are 4 vaccines that have been approved at the time of releasing this video. There may yet be more. 2 of those vaccines are what are called mRNA vaccines, and 2 of them are DNA vaccines. They're very similar, just a little bit different in how they are constructed and how they convey the genetic information. Now, the 2 DNA vaccines that have been approved are what are called viral vector vaccines. And that means that they use a non-harmful virus to deliver the genetic information of the virus they're trying to stop. And so they might use another cold virus or some other relatively non-harmful virus to deliver the genetic information for the Sars-CoVid-19 information. In this case, what they're doing is delivering the genetic information of a particular spike protein that exists on the surface of the Sars-CoVid-19 virus. Viral vector vaccines have been around for quite a while. In fact, since the 1970s, we've been using this form of vaccinating in different ways and in different applications. mRNA vaccines are a newer technology. In fact, more recently developed, and this is the first real instance of them being used in this scope, especially to provide vaccines. As a newer vaccine, there's maybe some more questions around how that works and what that is delivered, or what that is doing. The mRNA refers to the genetic code or the genetic information of this spike protein that is then delivered into the body so that it might prepare its immune system for how it can respond to this virus. Now, again, at no point does someone actually get COVID-19 as a result of these vaccines. It's just the genetic information that's delivered. That's the mRNA aspect, or what is written in the DNA aspect as well. These newer vaccines are really quite simple, actually, in their manufacturing. They only contain just a few ingredients, and I think it might be important for us to know that the mRNA vaccine has in it only the mRNA, that is the genetic information, and then it carries that in certain lipids, which is just another word for fat that is used to surround the genetic protein information to protect it, really. Then they add a few elements to help balance the pH level. One of those is often sodium chloride, which is just salt, right? No different than the salt you might have on your table during dinner. And then finally, they also use sucrose, which is just a sugar, and that's used as a stabilizer. Those are really the only ingredients in there. And in fact, I think it's kind of beautiful in its simplicity in the way that they've been able to do that. That being said, there are some other things that we have to consider as Christians when we think about vaccines and getting vaccines and the use of vaccines in society. And so, for instance, it is known that in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, in the creation of that and the manufacturing of that, they used certain cells that come out of a line of cells that were harvested from aborted fetuses. And as Christians who believe in the sanctity of life from conception, we know that that is important and that matters. And so that has to be part of our conversation here. Now, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine uses cells that are connected to cells from an aborted fetus that were collected in the late 60s and then used and manufactured in the 70s. And those cells have become known as the so-called immortal cells. And that's because they keep replicating and they keep using them and they keep growing them in petri dishes to provide for this sort of research and to provide for this kind of medical investigation and experimentation. But the cells that Johnson & Johnson used are actually clones of those cells. So they're not even directly connected. Well, they're genetically connected. They are not connected directly to the cells that were harvested from this aborted fetus. And yet, of course, this has to play a role in our discernment. And I think, as Christians, there are a few principles for our ability to discern in cases like this about a certain vaccine or a certain medical technology. In this case, there's a principle of what some people call the principle of proximity. Here what we're talking about the closeness to this actual event. And so these cells were first harvested in the 1960s and then applied and used in the 1970s. And so that's a significant amount of time since then. Now that alone, of course, isn't enough, but also in the principle of proximity, it's important to recognize that these are clones of those cells. They're not directly, they're not the direct descendants of the harvested cells. They are themselves clones. And again, those two things alone are probably not enough for us to be unconcerned. Our concern remains as Christians in the world. But we also have to think critically about this through what I'm going to call the principle of recurrence. And what I mean by that is if we were to accept this vaccine or permit the use of these particular cells, would that lead to the recurrence of more fetal abortions? And in this case, it seems clear that no, it would not, in and of itself, lead to more abortions because, again, these cells have been carefully cultured and continued on. That's why they're called the immortal cells. And so, because of this medical exploration and application, we are not likely directly related or directly to result to see more fetal abortions. Finally, a third principle to consider, or a third reality maybe to consider, and this one I would say is probably in a different category than the first two, but that is the ability for us to choose. And the reality is right now for most of us in Canada, given the supply and demand economics around the vaccine, that we will not be given a choice as to what vaccine we can use and what vaccine we will receive. You will be given the opportunity to get the vaccine and you have a choice to take it or not. Now, like I said, each one of those things individually may not be enough to give us pause or question the use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But I think each one of those things together does at least give us ground to ease our conscience as we come into this. But this is where I want to throw it to you. What are your thoughts on all of this, and how are you thinking theologically about vaccines and about medical technology, and how are you allowing our love of neighbor to encourage us into this future reality together? I'm going to end by saying I fully plan on being vaccinated when it is my opportunity to do so and my time to get in that queue. But I leave it to you. Let me know what you think in the comments below, or have an opportunity to take this discussion with your family and friends around you. Thanks again for joining us. Keep on studying.